Before we get started, a quick note to our listeners. Technical difficulties during recording resulted in some minor sound quality issues, but we didn't want to miss the chance to share this great conversation on hurricane resiliency and the Ding Darling Project. Thank you for your understanding and for tuning in.
But when this thing works, when the coast rises and when we're all sitting at our houses watching the Weather Channel, how is this thing going to operate? How's it going to look when it's done? And that's been the big thing, making sure, like Carl said, is there a way to protect it from these erosions that's going to come up from these high tides and these waves?
Hurricanes are a fact of life along our coastal communities, but each storm teaches us something new about how we design, protect, and rebuild our communities. Joining us in this episode are John Kilgore and Carl Spirio from BNN, and Heather Carruthers and Scott Maloney from K2M Designs to talk about what it means to strengthen stormwater systems and natural habitats to better withstand future storms. We'll explore lessons learned from recent hurricanes like Milton and Ian and take a look at the restoration work underway at the J.N. Ding Darling National Wildlife Refuge on Sanibel Island, Florida. This nationally protected refuge is home to vibrant mangrove forests, tidal marshes, and diverse wildlife, but years of limited tidal circulation and damage from recent hurricanes have put that delicate ecosystem at risk. Together, our guests are helping lead efforts to restore water flow, improve stormwater resilience, and protect this critical habitat for generations to come. Welcome, John, Carl, Heather, and Scott. We got a full house today on this episode to talk about hurricanes and resiliency. And before we do that, I'd like to introduce you guys to our audience. So, we'll just start with John and Carl from the BNN side. So, Carl, let's start with you. How did you find your way to the civil engineering industry? And can you tell us a little bit about your role here at BNN?
Been with BNN for just under 3 years now, 37 years in the industry, almost 38. Fortunate enough to go through FDOT for 18 years, make it all the way up to the state drainage engineer and kind of deal with resiliency from a national and state perspective and seeing it all across Florida and how it's impacted areas more so in the southeast area, more so than the rest of the state. But there's been a lot of, just a lot of changes in the way we deal with our infrastructure and how we're managing our systems. But then more importantly, how are we making them more sustainable as the conditions continue to grow?
And John.
Yeah, so John Kilgore. I'm the transportation director for Burgess & Nyepel here in the region of Florida. I've been with the company just over 5 years. Of course, our company Icon was acquired by Burgess & Nyepel back in 2020. So altogether, 10 years with this company. It's a great opportunity to lead this group. This transportation group includes Carl's drainage team, but also we have a significant team for roadway, drainage, traffic, and bridge inspection, about 60 employees here in Florida that come under my purview. And so we do a lot of work for Florida DOT, but also a lot of municipalities. And so when this opportunity came up to work with Deb Lohmeyer out of our Virginia office, referred us to K2M, and we got this opportunity to pursue the Ding Darling project. We felt like it was a great opportunity to highlight Carl's experience, his team's experience in doing projects like that, and then utilizing the resources that we have here in Florida for structures, for roadway, for drainage. So it's been a really good opportunity for our team.
Speaking of K2M Designs, we have a couple of guests from K2M Designs, so it's pretty exciting. This is only the second time we've had non-BNN guests on the podcast. So, welcome, Heather and Scott. Heather, we'll start with you alphabetically. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your role at K2M Designs.
Sure. So I've been with K2M for about 4.5 years. I'm the Director of Business Development for the Southeast region and PIC for all the work that we've done in the Keys. I came to K2M, though, I think probably because of my experience as a county commissioner here in Monroe County. I spent 12 years. I've lived here 26 years, been through multiple hurricanes. I owned a small guest house prior to that and had to deal with hurricanes then as well, and certainly lived through Hurricane Irma and really understand how important resiliency is, both in the immediate aftermath and also in the recovery period.
And last but not least, Scott, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do at K2M?
Certainly. I'm the official note taker for K2M Design, the owner and founder of the organization. I'm employee number one. In all seriousness, no. My primary role is I serve as a project principal, which is really where my heart is in the early conceptual phasing of work. I really help people think through, going from a white sheet of paper into an idea and realizing their visions. That's where my strengths lie, as well as the relationships that I build with great companies like yours.
We have you guys on here today to talk about hurricanes and resiliency. So major storms like Hurricane Ian and, a little bit more recently, Milton, they've left a lasting impact on coastal communities and ecosystems. So if we look back on storms like those, what are some of the key lessons and takeaways when it comes to the infrastructure vulnerability, the ecosystem resiliency, and, maybe a little bit how we plan for future storms?
Great question. I think, the biggest thing is asset management. We need to know what we have out there and what the current lifespan is of a lot of that infrastructure, because as we look at making ourselves more resilient and more sustainable to conditions the way they change, what do we need to do from an infrastructure standpoint? We're working on a project now in the city of St. Pete, same kind of situation where we've got a lot of infrastructure that's going to be redone. And as we look at that, and as we look at what the coastal changes are, how do we better prepare those systems to be, more resilient to the conditions? And what I mean by that is you're going to get a lot of storm surge. And so in coastal lying areas or in coastal environments, it's not always a simple matter of just elevating roads. Everybody always thinks that that's our primary focus. Just elevate roads, elevate seawalls, and you're good. What you have to do is you have to balance it, because if we're not thorough in our thinking, you're going to inundate flooding for a longer period of time and create situations far worse than what you envisioned. On top of that, the more we elevate roads, depending upon how the storm comes in, you can flood areas that may not have been as flood prone to conditions like that. So it's a very comprehensive and planning type exercise to really understand what you have, what are the conditions out there that you got to mitigate for. And I think more importantly, Hurricane, and John, remind me, which one was before Milton?
Right, Helene.
Helene didn't even hit the coast and just ran up along the west side of Florida, and yet it inundated so many communities and quite substantially. And it just shows you that no matter how well we plan, there's going to be a scenario that's not accounted for. When we run some of these big models, it doesn't always really portray what the real conditions are that you'll experience. So it's a very interdisciplinary type exercise. You really got to bring the right people together. You got to look at, first and foremost, what you have for your infrastructure, how we're going to mitigate for that, and then more importantly, your plan of actions. How are you going to address this once the storm does hit? How do we get first responders back in there and get them in there quickly? And that's really a lot of my design criteria. Is I'm not so much looking at the evacuation routes. I'm looking more, how do we get people back in there with supplies and the medical attention for those that decide not to evacuate, and kind of give them the services that they need.
Ian obviously is the one that really affected Sanibel and the Sting Darling area here in this part of Florida that we're talking about today. But I know last year, I live along the coast in the town of Tarpon Springs, and I had the Gulf in my garage. So that's the first time. I lived there 7 years. It's never even come near my house. So we're having to get ready for that kind of thing. But I did want to say we do a lot of projects along this area for transportation. I wanted to bring this point up because one of the things in working with Record Partners that we're discovering is that there needs to be improved, and we're working on that with all of our bridge jobs, to improve the revetment or improve the, putting in some kind of resiliency to those things, because we're recognizing that storms are rising higher than they have in past times. So putting in ways to armor and protect these bridges from having washouts that seem to be occurring more and more.
It's interesting you're talking about road elevation. That's been a big issue here in Monroe County. Frankly, not just with a storm and storm surge, but with king tides that happen regularly and even extreme thunderstorms. We're in an area that's surrounded by a national marine sanctuary, so we have very strict regulations about the quality of the water that gets released back into the ocean. So it's not just about elevating a road to keep the water off of it. It's about also keeping the water out of the neighbors who live alongside that road. And it's about making sure that the water that goes back in is clean and does not carry all that dirty runoff. So they're very expensive. I mean, we now estimate it's about $1 million a mile when we do this kind of work. That introduces really interesting questions about, do we do it everywhere? Or are there some roads where maybe there's not enough houses that are worth the investment? So they're very difficult decisions for leadership to be making.
Heather, you're going to make a perfect civil engineer in your next career, I promise. But, one of the things that I've noticed, and I'm certainly you have as long as you all have been in Florida, and us in the Florida Keys for 22 plus years now, good gracious, is the scale of these storms and the strength of the storms is growing year over year. And I think about when we first started designing post Andrew, and it was, 150 mile an hour was like the greatest thing people could imagine. And you just watched those building codes, tick up. And it's not just the wind, but it's also the wall of water and the flooding that will occur after it, the tornado that occurs after it. when the power comes on and the electricity burns your house down after it made it through the tornado, the hurricane, and the flood. And really what you start looking at in terms of resiliency and true, as Carl said, sustainability of your buildings and structures and how you manifest that self in its design.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we need to start thinking about is not building to code, but building code plus. Adding another foot doesn't really cost that much money, but it saves you money in terms of your flood insurance and also helps protect you and, gives you a little bit more space. But, to your point, Carl, you earlier said it's not just about elevating buildings. One of the issues that we have down here is when you elevate a building and your neighbor's car or boat gets picked up and gets shoved into your pilings and your building falls down. So, you have to think thoroughly about this kind of building. And I mean, we've been exceeding the 180 mile per hour code down here in most of our vertical construction for, years. And we just have to. And the same thing, we actually will recommend going about 3 feet above base flood now, at least. As long as you don't have a height limit, might have to be a little squishy there, but, let's get it out of the way.
I think the only thing that, Heather, I'm sure you remember when the city of Miami Beach started elevating some of their roadways, the unintended consequence is the first floor now became uninsurable. Bottom floor now was no more than just storage because, that infrastructure wasn't thoroughly thought through. Insurance companies had a hard time ensuring that, knowing that they were going to be more vulnerable to flooding. So it's such a planning exercise. And then what is your FEMA community rating system? What are you trying to achieve with that? And how are you going to try and take that to a higher level so that now, in theory, you're going to get better rates on insurance, but it's got to be comprehensive in its thinking.
In Monroe County in the Florida Keys, for years, we had this thing called the downstairs enclosures where people were actually living in the spaces beneath the elevated homes. And as a result, we weren't even allowed to participate in the community rating system. It's very difficult, but, we had to tell people you got to remove these downstairs enclosures. And over the years, as we've continued to do that and you worked with the real estate community to also make sure that there's disclosures and purchases, now I think we're 20% discount, community-wide because of the CRS. But none of it stands in a vacuum. Everything you do connects with something else.
All of you kind of touched on this a little bit, how to deal with these storms and stormwater systems. So, how are those engineering and ecological strategies coming together to support even more resilience as, we see more unexpected impacts from, a hurricane or a tropical storm?
I think you're talking about the natural resiliency too, and what we can do for natural forces. I mean, here in the Keys, we have mangroves, obviously, which help protect. There's a lot of work that we do to make sure that people can't trim the mangroves. Coral reefs are also a big issue down here. And there are a huge number of about, 3 different nonprofits that are growing and outplanting to provide that kind of, protection against the wave activity that comes with any kind of storm surge. But I know that you guys employed a number of different nature resiliency methods when you did Ding Darling.
Looking at Ding Darling in particular, there's a fairly good strand of mangroves all around that National Wildlife Reserve. The beauty of it is they took some damage, but they maintained their footprint as much as practical, and much more so than you would expect with hardened infrastructure. Hardened infrastructure is fine, but then you've got all the other remedies that you've got to do. So if you put up a seawall, now you got to do rubble riprap, you got to do some other things. And then the impact on the environment is that now you're taking away potential areas for mangrove and seagrass growth. So how do we find that balance as we're looking at this? And that's the beauty of nature-based solutions. Now, they may not be as robust as what you would get with hardened infrastructure, but you're getting that environmental component that you can't buy. And what I mean by that is when I look out all around Ding Darling after Hurricane Ian hit, there was so much damage, especially over in Fort Myers, as you guys know, where the storm actually came across. But that's all area that had been, redeveloped. When you left these natural systems in place, they did such a good job on dissipating that energy. The other thing that we typically do with roadways that gets us in trouble is we let the wave action come all the way into the revetment or into the embankment of the roadway, as opposed to kind of doing some buffers out ahead, kind of some wave dissipators, in advance of the coastline. And by that, then you dissipate that energy. The benefit is now you're going to create a new ecological system. And they do this down in the Caribbean a lot, where they'll put these wave revetments out into the water, a couple hundred yards off the coast. And what happens is you get a whole ecology that forms in these areas now. So they serve 2 benefits. One, they dissipate the energy, but then 2, it creates all this nice diving area, kind of like what you do maybe a regional pond where you got a lot of bird watching and you get all this, wildlife that comes in. Same thing with the revetment. If you set up and you design it the right way, you're going to get that new marine environment that's going to occur there. You're going to get a good chance for seagrass growth. And so again, it's looking at this more comprehensively. Let's not just check a box and get from A to B to C. what do we need to do to get from A to C, but maybe it goes through other steps to get there. And then we bring in environmental things that help us from a permitting standpoint. And that's the beauty that I see on Ding Darling. We have a chance to really reestablish a lot of mangrove growth that was impacted by the original construction of Wildlife Drive. And I see that as being an overall benefit, not only to the wildlife refuge, but then also to the marine life that it supports.
I think on specifically on Ding Darling, what I recognize is that the roadway was kind of blocking the wetland to get recharged, I guess. And so there were some nutrient issues. Carl's definitely an expert on that. But what we're trying to do here, and I think it's a good investment by U.S. Fish and Wildlife, is to add some more openings there within that roadway to get more circulation inside to that infield area. And if you've been out there, it's a beautiful area. I do see, though, that it's not thriving like it should. So when Carl and I did our site visit, he pointed out some areas where these would be good areas. And it's been like a back and forth with Fish and Wildlife. We're working with Bob there with Fish and Wildlife and came up with some great ideas of where he saw some inflection points where he could see, hey, this is a high benefit to add maybe an opening here. And, limited budget. They don't have the world's amount of money to spend on the shop, but where could we add some either box culverts or bridges that can provide that circulation for this natural area? I know our team here, I'm a roadway guy, right? So I'll speak about roadway, but coming up with solutions to tie to the bridges that are coming in and working with our structures need to make sure we're addressing scour, addressing all of that. We're going to put something that's going to be lasting. But the roadway improvements themselves, you're going to have people, visitors to this park coming and wanting to see things. So we've been really back and forth with what does Fish and Wildlife want? What do they want to see? They want to create an area too where people can get out and see how this is going to work, how this flows. But when this thing works, when the coast rises and when we're all sitting at our houses watching the Weather Channel, how is this thing going to operate? How's it going to look when it's done? And that's been the big thing, making sure, like Carl said, is there a way to protect it from these erosions that's going to come up from these high tides and these waves?
John, you mentioned, doing all this work and getting people to come out to see it. And I think that's an economic benefit for any community. I mean, we have a whole state that's based on tourism, and I know there's a lot of effort now towards ecotourism. A double bang for our buck here if we're using nature-based solutions for resiliency, but also to attract visitors to support our economy.
Heather, you just kind of touched on there is how are projects, like Ding Darling help communities and ecosystems prepare even further for hurricanes and sea level rise, as well as, changing coastal conditions. What does that long-term resilience look like 10, 15, 20 years out, if that's something we've already started to think about?
Yeah, no, I think the biggest thing going forward is, you got to assess your infrastructure and where are those critical areas that you definitely want to protect. And the way I've always looked at it, especially the way we address this at DOT, is where's your critical infrastructure that's primary one? What's that area that can take on some inundation from time to time without real impacts to the infrastructure? And then where are those areas that you're just going to allow just to be inundated? That's where I think these natural systems can become those areas. Like I said, Ding Darling, looking at what they experienced during Hurricane Ian and knowing they were right there in the heart of the storm, the system did well. It managed well. But again, you have a good mangrove strand out there. And that's what's important, I think, to make these. What you'll see across Florida is, and Miami Beach was an example of this, Captiva or Sanibel Island is another one. These used to be the natural sacrificial areas for storms back in the day. The problem is people went over to the island, they saw these areas and said, man, this would be awesome for development. So now that natural protection that could have been there for the coastline or for the mainline is gone because now it's all being absorbed by, development. And I get it. Miami Beach, prime example of that. That used to be the protection for Miami. So as we look at this going forward now, do we need to start looking at more of a retreat line, or do we need to look at some other remedies that we're not going to allow development to occur in certain areas? And then can these areas now then be reestablished to serve as that buffer that they used to provide? Because otherwise now what we're doing is now we're going to have to go out further, a couple hundred yards off the coastline for these barrier islands and protect them to protect the barrier island, which then protects the main line. So it's a delicate because, even in Hurricane Katrina up in New Orleans, as you saw, we've lost an area that was below sea level. And to ask people to get up their homes, you're not going to get that kind of initial, buy-in. You're going to have to really sell them. So same thing down here. When you've got an area that for 363 days out of the year, you've got the most beautiful scenery you can see. And now you're saying, well, there's 2 days are going to come that are going to be real turbulent. And that's why we want to take your property from you. That's going to be a hard sell. This happened in Australia. Australia's lost coastline before. All the high-dollar homes were on the coastal side. All they did was they went across the street and they bought up people on the other side of the road, and then they reestablished their homes there. They're not going to give up that view. So now that's where we've got to come in, and we've really got to look at these systems more robustly. It's a planning. You've got to work with the planners, and it's got to be, okay, this is the area that we're going to manage. And then these are the areas that we're going to let go. And that's where the parks, I think, then provide that good opportunity. And Ding Darling being a prime example of that. You've got a really nice system out there. You let the public enjoy it, but then also it's providing protection for Sanibel. And that's what's critical, I think.
The public buy-in aspect is really critical because, people are going to dig in and say, I'm not retreating. So you have to make sure that that they understand what the value of doing that is. Just as you have to make them understand what the value is of making these investments in infrastructure and in building to above code. One of the things that always strikes me, we talk about hurricanes only almost exclusively here in Florida, but we have other related issues with climate change, including extreme heat is actually the bigger killer than hurricanes and tornadoes all combined. It just is. When we take away the natural environment to pave it, we are actually creating additional heat islands so that issue gets exacerbated. So the more we can be creative about things that we do, we did a little project in St. Lucie. We were just going after a particular project and our architects did green roofs. Even just doing something like a green roof can help with sustainability and resiliency too. So the less we rely on air conditioning, the better off we're going to be.
As we kind of look more towards the future, are there any other emerging tools or strategies that really get you excited for, future work for building up our community's resiliencies to these storms? Like, maybe is there a method that is like really promising theories, or is there like really early in the practice that you're like, oh, I'm really excited to see where this can take us?
As much green infrastructure as we can include is important. We're seeing people who are now saying, I want to build to LEED standards, but I don't want to pay for this certification because that's going to get too expensive. So, a good portion of our architects are already LEED certified. So that just is part of what we do naturally. I think that there's some interesting issues related to water reuse and water reclamation on an individual property basis, as well as on a community basis that people are starting to explore. Down here, we've had a lot of people looking at different ways of generating energy, tidal energy, wind energy, and certainly solar. Anything that you can do to incorporate that on an individual basis. When we start to take people off the grid, it can get a little scary sometimes. But the thing about taking people off the grid is that when we have these major climate changes and climate impacts, everybody's not out. There's still a house that you can go to that's still got a fridge and air conditioning. So, how do we start to incorporate that into everything that we do every day?
I think one of the great things about that off-grid technology, in the event of when the next storm happens, it enables you to recover faster. A lot of the post impacts of storms are mitigated, with that basic recovery. When you're able to have water, when you're able to have power, and your basic modern conveniences are there in place. I think a lot of that has to do with it. I'll tell you this, as we look more and more into the building technologies as they get stronger, Heather mentioned we've been designing 180, but we're now into 200 mile an hour winds and looking stronger. Now it requires the manufacturing world to catch up to what we're looking at doing. But I remember when we were first looking at 150 mile an hour wind and trying to find a window. Now everybody has a 150 mile an hour window. You think about it real basic like that. Imagine if you had a 200 mile an hour window and the wall system to be able to support it. And the greater attention and focus on resiliency, I think, is really what the future continues to hold for us. And it gives us an opportunity to maybe invent some newer technologies or improve on tried and true ones that get us to these storms in a better, safer fashion for everything around us. And whether that's, land, sea, air, buildings, etc., it's really just how we weather the storm.
Speaking from a roadway standpoint and how we can try to improve resiliency for roadways. And I've seen this with how we're addressing projects on Florida DOT system as well. But in coastal areas, obviously we've gone to putting in mast arms instead of span wire signals in locations just to make sure that the signals don't fall on the ground. I know I was here in 2004 when Hurricane Charlie came to Port Charlotte, and I think we put together 49 signalized intersections had signals on the ground that we had to go out and get restored. And so that was a big thing to put back together. But one of the other things we've noticed, and this is totally off topic for Ding Darling, but is the use of roundabout intersections instead of signalized intersections. Roundabouts always work, even when the power's out. and they seem to keep people moving. So the last thing you want to do is come to an intersection after the power's out, the signals are laying on the ground, nobody knows where to go, the police aren't there, roundabouts continue to work. So even that seems kind of ridiculous for resiliency, but it actually kind of makes sense, right? You just, you may have to purchase a little more right away, but you can keep traffic moving. And I think I've seen Florida grow more towards roundabouts in the last 10 years than they have in the past. So hopefully this is going to be something that can be utilized more and more, especially in some of these coastal communities where it just kind of makes sense. People are kind of inundated. They're trying to get in and out. It makes sense. So.
And I think one other thing that would be beneficial, and it's something that we're really starting to get going with here in Florida, we've got the One Water Commission now. And I think what we need to do is, and that's all about planning. So as we look across the landscape, whether it be Ding Darling, where you got a good natural reserve or refuge where, you've got all the environmental benefits there, what are the other things that we need to do as it relates to One Water? And what I mean by that in this is we've got a resiliency component, we've got a sustainability component, we've got water resources. We're a very water-rich state, but we don't manage that resource as well as we can. So as we go forward, can we use stormwater to kind of now serve as a natural barrier to saltwater intrusion? It doesn't impact Ding Darling, but other areas in the coastal environment, can we create some now scenarios where we're using stormwater to kind of actually serve as a natural protection for us? And again, Heather, you touched on this earlier. We're always so enamored with hurricanes, but there's a lot more going on in our state aside from hurricanes. You look out west, you see where droughts are creating fires, which now changes the whole landscape. And now your runoff from those areas has increased substantially because you don't have that rich forest that you used to have there. So now those areas are more vulnerable to landslides and stuff like that. Florida's probably one drought away from having real water, and I mean potable water issues. So as we look at this, how do we start saving those resources and protect them, more importantly, and then not get into a lot of other infrastructure work that needs to be done, just further complicates the situation. So I think stakeholder engagement and funding. If we can now get communities to work together, counties and cities, and collaborate more on how they're going to spend that money and give us that resiliency that we're looking for, and then grant money to go with it, I think that's where we really need that planning component. And I really honestly think that One Water can help us do that. But we've got to start putting people in strategic places that are looking for those projects that everybody's doing. And how do we marry things together and spend our money more efficiently and effectively? That way we're not just throwing money here, throwing money there, and not using it in a collaborative manner. We got to become more collaborative with this. It's the only way we're going to do it. Because Heather, you touched on this earlier. If it's $1 million a mile or whatever that number you quoted, I mean, that's a lot of money. So how do we now bring that money together and make it work in a useful manner and address more than one thing? Let's fix the roads. Let's fix the infrastructure. Let's fix our environmental permitting.
I mean, we've got this system that they've got a road at elevation 5. The tide goes up to 9. I mean, you can't do anything about that. But what we can do is to put in, flap gates or something, some way to keep the water from coming in during these tidal events. The water's not like percolating through and coming out of the inlets into people's yards. And so, I mean, talk maybe a little bit more about that.
Yeah, no, I mean, and you're on it. I mean, it's just looking at, king tides, neap tide, any other tides that, just nuisance flooding. How do we better protect ourselves from that and then still allow that capacity in the system? And again, it's not a real expensive endeavor, but, it's something that you got to commit to, just like anything else. But then more importantly, have we addressed, everybody within that area? And are we getting that collaboration that we need? Because if we do it, somebody else doesn't, it's going to exasperate their flooding elsewhere. And that's why it needs to be done in unison.
Can you kind of dive into what makes those collaborations work well for the long-term project goals? And why is it more so important now than ever that we make sure that we're putting these high-risk coastal communities to front and center?
I don't know where we ever got away from us not working together because, some of it's politically based. Some of it's, just preferences of a community or whatever. The bottom line is water knows no delineations. It doesn't know political boundaries. It doesn't know whatever. So we now address this in the right manner. So what I mean by that is now Florida's done this a lot. We've got our compacts in certain areas. Heather, I'm sure you're aware of the Southeast Compact, and you guys were part of that. We've got the Central Florida Compact, the Southwest Compact. I don't know if they've ever finally adopted all their charters and that, and they're fully integrated now in terms of a group. But looking at this, we're now, you're trying to marry the projects together, like I mentioned earlier. But by that, you need that orchestrator. You need somebody that can be out there knowing what's going on, whether it be the Water Management District, the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. But somebody's got to be in these strategic areas where they're seeing the projects that are coming in. And let's marry that money together. Because again, like I said, the magnitude of the cost is going up. It's not going to get any cheaper. And with Florida going through the growth that we're going through and a number of people are coming in, if we don't do it now, we're never going to get there. So it really does become a stakeholder, meeting, and it's got to be done fairly routinely so that people understand, because there's a lot of projects that come up for cities and counties. It really comes down to their funding, their political leadership, because you're going to see a change in leadership every 4 years. And from what I've always been told in this industry, and it's fairly truthful, it's 7 years to get change to really be implemented. So you're going to go through at least one political regime to get to another. How do we document these agreements that the agreements will go beyond, the leadership, and that we really address the issues that need to be addressed? And let's not make it a political issue. Politics shouldn't even be involved in this. I mean, we're talking about, how do we make ourselves more, sustainable to the conditions that we see are changing? And then how do we address that going forward? And I think that's where you got to do the planning up front, because we've got to get the funding and we've got to get the timing of the projects in line with each other so that your stakeholders can buy that. DOT, typically they're looked at. The problem is that their work program's so prescriptive, they've got to address that project within the time period that they've accounted for. Sometimes the cities and counties aren't that structured, so they're not ready for that kind of a robust schedule and the funding to go with it. Plus, their money is not just dedicated to transportation. It's dedicated to schools. It's dedicated to first responders. It's going a lot further. So that's where I think that collaboration's got to be. And it's all planning. I hate to say it. You've heard me say it many a times. Planning and collaboration, you've got to have that interaction. That dialogue's got to be maintained. That's the only way they're going to be implemented.
It's got to be a holistic approach. We can't be siloed anymore.
One of the contracts we have outside of this project is we're supporting Florida DOT here in the Tampa Bay area. District 7 is our drainage engineer. And so in that role, we're always reviewing their connection permits. We're always involved with what's coming up, how we can support that. But in working with DOT and talking to some of their folks here even recently, it's like, how did you get prepared for this year's storm events? What are you doing? They're getting out and they're inspecting all of their pipes now. They're cleaning up pipes ahead of in areas that they know that they've had issues in the past. They're making sure those pipes aren't sitting there silted up today ahead of storm so that they're going to function when they need to function. So I think that's important to do too, is to really collaborate with our clients, with our communities to see, hey, where are these areas? What can we be doing now to get prepped and make sure we're armored for these things when they happen?
It's important for us to be really focusing a lot on these coastal areas, and for a couple of reasons. I mean, the coastal areas, except for the world, that's where our economy comes from in terms of whether we're supporting our fisheries or our tourism. I mean, that's where everybody wants to be. And, we're human beings. I can never imagine a time when human beings are not going to want to live by the water. So we have to continue to invest both in infrastructure and in robust vertical architecture to make sure people can continue to do that.
I'm in landlocked Columbus. I wish I could live by the water. I might have to make my way down there in December or January.
Just remember, from all the things that you're learning, elevate. The 9th floor is okay.
We've been talking for quite a while now, and I feel like I've learned so much, but barely scratched the surface. For anyone out there who's listening and wants to improve their stormwater infrastructure or protect their local ecosystems in preparation for storms or even stronger storms, what should their first steps be? And how should they go forward and get in contact with BNN or K2M?
Here in Florida, we work with a number of clients. We have relationships outside of Florida DOT with a number of counties and cities within the Tampa Bay area, even over into Orange County and Central Florida area. So I would say just give us a call. Carl Spuriel can be very reachable. I can be reachable. And we can just come meet with you and talk about the issues that you're having. I know we did that recently with Charlotte County. Came down and talked to them about some of the issues that they're having down there. And even though we don't have a contract with them, we're going to keep listening and following up with them to see how we can support them. But I think it starts with a relationship. I think that's been the key that we've seen in all of this, is like, you got to know who you're talking to and not be just a face and then you hand it over to somebody sitting in a cube. If you give us a call, we're going to talk to you. We're going to work with you to figure out how we can do it. And if we can't figure it out, then we'll find out who can help you. And I know working with K2M is really key for us too, because it opens up opportunities with us, with other clients that we haven't worked with in the past, like Fish and Wildlife here in Florida. So we look forward to new opportunities that are going to arise from just this initial Ding Darling project. We think it's going to open the door for other opportunities to do similar solutions.
And very similarly to what John said, and as we look at the, vertical facilities, understanding the condition of your building and the condition of your site, I think is extremely important. And whether that's from the utility perspective, all of your infrastructure, roads, bridges, the building itself or buildings themselves, really understand what their condition is and what they're going to be capable of supporting, and tie that to how resilient we want to make those buildings. And then you really have an opportunity to have a conversation on what do I need to do and what and when can you do it, which is the most important thing as funding becomes available, as everybody has been talking about in the last comment. And so we work all across the state, being that as a multi-year and multi-project teaming partner of ours, and be happy, please, to go where they go and vice versa.
And I agree. I think it's these types of collaborations just amongst our two companies that help us to expand what we can offer to others. I think the biggest thing is keeping a genuine attitude about it. Look, we want to help. That's first and foremost. As humans, we want to help. Hopefully it does relate into a business, but the bigger thing is that we're there to support the communities and help them better understand from lessons learned how they can improve their infrastructure, and then how can we be there to support them. And I think that's what makes even a better relationship in the end.
Thank you, everyone. This was very informative.
Nice to talk to you guys.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us on this episode. If you're interested in learning more, you can contact John and Carl at BNN or Heather and Scott at K2M to see how you can be better prepared for future hurricanes and severe storms. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast to be notified when the latest episodes come out, and don't forget to follow our LinkedIn and Instagram pages to see what's happening at BNN.